The most dangerous thing you can be is certain. Not wrong, not confused, not misinformed. Certain. Because when you are wrong, there is still a chance, some small opening where a question can get through. A pause, a moment where the story you've been telling starts to feel slightly off. But certainty closes that opening completely. It doesn't feel like arrogance. It doesn't announce itself. It feels exactly like clarity, like finally seeing something as it really is. And that is what makes it so difficult to examine. There's a particular kind of conflict, the kind that keeps returning, the kind that never fully resolves, that isn't really about facts or fairness or who said what. It's about two people who are absolutely certain. Not certain about the same thing, but certain with the same intensity. And somewhere in the collision of those two certainties, something gets lost. Not the argument, something quieter than that. This episode is not about being wrong. It's about what happens before you're willing to find out. There was a moment at work, small enough that most people wouldn't have noticed it. A decision had been made in a meeting, a direction was set, and one person, someone who had been on the team for years, someone who cared deeply about the work, walked out of that room quietly certain that the wrong call had been made. Not in an aggressive way, not even in a way they would have described as resistance. Just a settled internal sense that this was not right, that they could see something the others couldn't. So they began to act accordingly. Not dramatically, they didn't argue loudly or push back in public. They simply continued doing things the way they believed was correct, answering questions in a way that reflected their own judgment, framing situations in a way that quietly supported their view. It felt reasonable. It felt like integrity. Weeks passed, small frictions appeared. A colleague would say one thing, they would subtly correct it. A plan would be outlined, they would quietly adjust their part of it. No one called it conflict exactly, but something was accumulating. And here is what's worth noticing. At no point did this person stop and ask, what if the meeting was right? What if I'm missing something? The question never arrived, not because they were incapable of asking it, but because they didn't feel the need to. They already knew, and knowing or feeling like you know removes the space where a question would live. It usually looks like this, not loud, not hostile, just someone operating from a conclusion they've already reached in a situation that hasn't finished revealing itself yet. Socrates spent his life doing something that most people find genuinely annoying, asking questions when everyone else had already moved on to answers. Not because he enjoyed the disruption, not because he was looking for intellectual victory, but because he noticed something that most of his contemporaries hadn't, that the people who were most confident in their beliefs were often the people who had examined those beliefs the least. And the ones who had done the least examination were also the ones most likely to cause harm, not out of malice, but out of the serene, untroubled conviction that they already understood. He called it a kind of ignorance, but it wasn't the ordinary kind, not the ignorance of someone who knows they don't know. It was the ignorance of someone who doesn't know that they don't know. And that second kind, he believed, was the more dangerous one, because it isn't uncomfortable. It doesn't itch. It doesn't push you toward any kind of inquiry. It just settles in quietly and starts to feel like wisdom. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. That person in the meeting, acting from their own judgment, certain they were seeing clearly, wasn't doing anything that most of us haven't done. The experience of certainty doesn't feel different from the experience of being right. They feel identical from the inside, which means the only way to tell them apart is to introduce a question. And questions, when you are certain, feel unnecessary. They feel like doubt, like weakness, like someone trying to undermine something that is already settled. There's a version of this that's easy to recognize in other people and nearly impossible to recognize in yourself. You can see it in a colleague who has decided how a project is going to fail and interprets every setback as confirmation. You can hear it in a family member who has a settled view of who you are and adjusts everything you say to fit inside that view. From the outside, the assumption is visible. From the inside, it is invisible because it isn't experienced as an assumption. It is experienced as accurate observation, as finally seeing something clearly. Part of you already knows this feeling. Here is the part that's harder to sit with. The assumptions we carry into a conflict, the ones we never question, usually weren't formed in the moment. They weren't constructed on the spot to justify a position. They arrived earlier, slowly, through a long accumulation of experience and observation, and things other people said when we were still deciding what kind of world this was. We learned what fairness looks like. We learned how effort should be recognized. We learned who deserves to be listened to, what kinds of problems are worth taking seriously, what it means when someone goes quiet or pushes back or changes their tone. We absorbed all of this, and most of it arrived before we were old enough to ask whether it was accurate. Well, imagine this. A child grows up in a home where conflict means danger, where disagreement, even minor disagreement, tends to escalate. Over years, they develop a very fast, very reliable internal system. Detect tension early, neutralize it, restore the surface. By adulthood, this system is invisible. They don't experience it as a learned response. They experience it as the right way to read a room. Now put that person into a workplace where direct conflict is normal and expected, where people argue loudly and then move on without residue. The system that was built for a different environment doesn't announce itself as a system. It presents itself as clarity, as accurate perception, as knowing what's really happening. And so when someone in that room raises their voice during a debate, just a debate, nothing serious, this person knows with complete certainty that something is wrong. They're not wrong to notice something, but they are carrying assumptions about what the something means, and those assumptions are old, older than this room, older than this team, older than any of the people in it. And this is where most people don't notice the shift. The certainty isn't about facts, it's about interpretation. And the interpretation arrives so quickly, so automatically, that it precedes any actual thinking. By the time conscious reasoning begins, the conclusion has already been reached. Socrates used a particular method when he encountered someone who was certain. He didn't argue, he didn't present a counterposition, he asked questions. Specific, careful questions not designed to trap or embarrass, but to follow the person's own thinking all the way to the edge of what they actually knew. And what he found almost every time was that the certainty dissolved before it got there. Not because the person was lying or foolish, but because the certainty had never been examined. It had simply been assumed. He called this a lenkus, a kind of cross-examination, not adversarial, more like a careful tracing of something back to its source to see whether the source was solid. And what he found, what continues to be found in every version of this inquiry, is that most beliefs, when followed to their roots, don't arrive at bedrock. They arrive at other beliefs, inherited ones, absorbed ones, ones that made sense in a particular context that no longer exists. The person in that meeting was not acting from analysis. They were acting from something older, a felt sense of rightness that had accumulated over time and was now presenting itself as a conclusion. And the reason they couldn't question it wasn't stubbornness exactly. It was that the belief had become invisible. It had fused with perception itself. It wasn't something they held, it was something they saw through. You've probably felt this before. The moment when a conversation tips and you feel something settle inside you. Not a decision exactly, more like a recognition. This is how this person is. This is what's really going on. This is the pattern. And once that recognition lands, it tends to stay. Evidence that confirms it gets absorbed easily. Evidence that complicates it tends to slide off. This isn't a flaw in the person. It's a feature of the way certainty operates. It is self-protecting by nature, not through active resistance, but through the quieter mechanism of simply not noticing what doesn't fit. What Socrates understood and what made him so genuinely irritating to so many people was that this self-protection isn't conscious. Nobody wakes up and decides to stop taking new information seriously. It happens gradually beneath awareness as the accumulated weight of experience compresses into a settled sense of how things are. And once something has become how things are, it stops being a belief that needs defending. It becomes the background, the context, the water you're swimming in. Questioning it then doesn't feel like intellectual rigor. It feels like someone asking you to doubt that the floor is solid. And this is where the damage accumulates, not in the loud moments, not in the arguments people remember, but in the quiet, ongoing space between two people who have each decided, without ever saying it, that they already understand the situation. Both of them filtering, both of them confirming, neither one able to see that what they're seeing is partly constructed, not fabricated, not dishonest, just assembled from materials that were never examined. Or maybe it appears differently for you. Maybe it's not in a workplace. Maybe it's in a relationship that has slowly settled into a set of roles, a set of meanings, a set of things that don't need to be said because everyone already knows. And in that knowing, that comfortable, unexamined knowing, something alive has gone quiet, not dramatically, just slowly, like a room that stops being opened. There's something Socrates said that has a different quality depending on how many times you've heard it. The first time it sounds like modesty, a clever rhetorical move. The second time it starts to feel heavier. And somewhere after that, it stops sounding like philosophy and starts sounding like something you already suspected, but hadn't quite let yourself think directly. He said that the unexamined life is not worth living. Not because examination makes life better, not because it produces happiness, but because without it something essential is missing, the contact with what is actually true as opposed to what feels true, what has always been assumed to be true, what everyone around you also believes without having examined it. It shows up in small, almost invisible ways. A parent who is certain their child is fragile and raises them accordingly, who has never asked whether fragility was the right frame or whether it was imported from somewhere else entirely. A partner who is certain that silence means contempt because in one particular history it did, and who responds to every quiet moment as though it confirms what they already know. A colleague who is certain that credit is being withheld, and who interprets every neutral interaction as evidence, because they learned long ago that this was how things worked. These aren't irrationalities, they are coherent systems. They make complete internal sense. And they cause real damage, not because the people who carry them are malicious, but because they are unexamined. And that's the uncomfortable part. Not that we might be wrong, but that we may never find out because the certainty we carry doesn't feel like a position we're holding. It feels like the truth. There's a further layer here that's worth slowing down for. When two people are in conflict, real conflict, the kind that repeats and never quite resolves, it is almost never the case that one person is simply right and the other is simply wrong. What's more often happening is that two unexamined certainties are meeting each other, each one internally consistent, each one assembled from real experience, real observation, real history. And neither one in contact with the other, because contact would require the kind of openness that certainty, by its nature, forecloses. This is what makes these conflicts so exhausting and so resistant to resolution. Because when you try to address what the conflict is supposedly about, you're working at the surface level. The argument about the decision, the argument about the tone, the argument about who said what, these are real, but they are not where the conflict actually lives. The conflict lives in the layer of assumption underneath, the layer that neither person can see because both are too certain to look. Until something changes. And what usually changes is not that someone finally proves they were right. It's that something happens, a loss, a surprise, a long silence that creates enough disruption to make an assumption visible, even briefly, even just to one person. Just enough to introduce a question where there had only been conclusions. Socrates didn't offer a method for becoming right. He offered something more unsettling than that. He suggested that the beginning of any real wisdom was the recognition of how much had not yet been examined, not as a failure, not as something to correct quickly and move past, but as a permanent condition, an ongoing relationship with one's own uncertainty that, when genuinely held, changes the quality of how a person moves through a conversation, through a conflict, through a life. This is not comfortable. It is much easier to be certain. Certainty organizes the world. It reduces the weight of each decision. It lets you know in advance how things are going to go, who people are, what situations mean. And in many small, practical ways, certainty functions well. It keeps things moving. But it also closes things off. The person who left that meeting already knowing the answer never had a chance to discover what the meeting actually contained. The parent who already knows their child is fragile never gets to see who the child might become without that frame. The partner who knows what silence means never gets to find out whether, this time, it means something different. There is a cost to certainty that we rarely calculate because certainty doesn't feel like a cost at the time. It feels like efficiency, like not wasting energy on questions that have already been settled. But what's being lost in that efficiency is the actual situation, the thing that is genuinely here, as opposed to the version of it that has already been decided. Socrates called this the examined life. Not a life of constant questioning, not a paralyzed life where nothing can be believed, but a life in which the questions are still alive. Where a belief, even a long-held one, can still be followed back to its source and asked to account for itself. Where the certainty, when it arrives, and it will arrive, because it always does, can occasionally be treated not as a conclusion, but as a prompt. Well, imagine this. A moment just before you speak in a conversation where something is already decided inside you. The conclusion has landed. You know what you're dealing with, and from that knowing, words begin to form. Not words of discovery, words of position, of confirmation, of someone who has already arrived. Now imagine, just for a moment, not being certain, not pretending, not forcing yourself toward false openness, but genuinely pausing at the edge of the conclusion you were about to reach and noticing that it is, in fact, a conclusion, not a fact, not a perception. A conclusion assembled from prior experience, shaped by history, filtered through assumptions that were never asked to justify themselves. That pause, that small, quiet interruption, is what Socrates was pointing toward. Not answers, not a better argument, just the recognition that something is being assumed. And that assumption, like anything that has not been examined, might not survive the first serious question. You might try noticing this next time, not in a dramatic way. Just the moment when certainty arrives, that settled, familiar feeling of already knowing, and seeing if it's possible to hold it slightly more loosely. Not because you're wrong, but because you don't yet know whether you're right. There is a difference between those two things. And that difference, small as it may seem, is where everything begins. The conflict isn't usually about what it says it's about. It's about two people, each certain, each operating from assumptions that feel indistinguishable from reality, meeting in a space where neither has thought to ask, where did this come from and is it still true? Socrates didn't promise that asking the question would make things easier. He only suggested that not asking it was the longer suffering. You don't have to dismantle everything you believe. You don't have to approach every conversation as a philosophical exercise or treat every assumption as suspect. That isn't the point, and it wouldn't be livable. But there is a particular moment, a specific kind of moment that you'll recognize if you've been paying attention, where certainty arrives very quickly and very completely, and settles before any real examination has taken place. Where you know how this is going to go, who this person is, what this situation means. In that moment, there is a question available. Not a challenge, not a demand for proof. Just a quiet, honest question directed inward. Is this something I know or something I've always assumed? That question won't always change the answer. Sometimes the certainty holds, and it holds because it's true. But occasionally, more often than is comfortable to acknowledge, the question finds an edge, a place where the ground is softer than it looked, where the certainty was real but the thing it was certain about was something older, something borrowed, something that arrived long before this conversation. And in that place, something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. Not resolution, not relief, just a little more room. Room for what's actually here, as opposed to what was already decided. That's not a small thing. It may be the only thing that changes anything.